Welcome to Counter-Apologetics.
Welcome to Counter-Apologetics. I'm your host, Emerson Green, and today we'll be discussing Jordan Peterson's God.
So people often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis.
Jordan Peterson is many things to many people, but one thing he happens to be is a passionate opponent of atheism and defender of Christianity, claiming that atheism is destructive and that we need religion for civilization to continue. Oddly enough, he doesn't really believe in God, at least not in any sense that the majority of theists would recognize. Peterson is attracting religious people to his audience, and he's not effectively communicating to them that he doesn't believe what they think he believes. And let me apologize in advance, whenever I play clips of Peterson to back up my claim, they're usually like a minute long, and I'm doing this because I'm trying to parse out what he actually thinks and I want to back up whatever I'm saying, and I'm trying to avoid misrepresenting him or at least being accused of that, but also because he doesn't really give short or simple answers. What is a Christian exactly? Who's a real Christian, and who gets to decide the criteria? Well, theology is totally a real discipline, and I'm sure if we give them enough time, they'll eventually figure it out. Well, hang on, let me just do a quick Google to make sure they haven't solved it. Refresh. And no, they still haven't figured it out. So anyway, I'm sure theology is on the verge of a breakthrough there. But for our purposes, the only thing we can really do is just consider a few of the most common definitions of Christian and see if Jordan Peterson fits any of them, or if he holds any traditionally Christian beliefs. The version of Christianity that I'm most familiar with is one based on a sort of biblical literalism. The Bible is the perfect word of God, it's literally true, and it's inerrant.
You got the scientific atheists on one end and you got the religious fundamentalists on the other, and what they both agree on, whether they like it or not, is that there's so much power in the scientific method that it's difficult to dispute the validity of scientific facts. And they seem to exist in contradiction to the older, archaic stories if you also accept them as fact-based accounts. And if you're on the fundamentalist side, you say, well, we'll try to shoehorn science into this framework, and really that doesn't work very well. It doesn't work very well with the claims of evolution, for example. In fact, it works very badly. And that's a problem, because evolutionary theory is like, it's a killer theory. And it's really, really hard. And like, it's not a complete theory, and there's lots of things we don't know about evolution, but you know, trying to hand wave that away, that's not going to work without dispensing with most of biology.
So he accepts scientific facts and theories, which is to say that he doesn't believe the Bible is factually and historically accurate. And that's fine, not every Christian is a young earth creationist. However, according to poll data, roughly 40% of the overall US population believes that the earth is less than 10,000 years old and humans were created in their current form. Which I think is worth mentioning, since it seems like so many people act as if it's just a tiny minority of Christians who take the Bible literally. Okay, so what about Peterson's belief in the teachings of Christ? I think it's fair to say that he accepts Jesus' teaching in some areas but not others. But merely agreeing with some of the nice things Jesus said can't be enough to be called a Christian. By that definition, many Hindus are Christians. And if polytheists can be Christians, we've stretched the definition to the point of being meaningless. The same goes for Christian being a synonym for kind or good. Under that definition, an atheist, Raelian, Muslim, or anyone who's a nice person or agrees with a couple things Jesus taught is a Christian. So Peterson fits those two definitions, but again, so do Raelians and Hindus. Peterson does not accept everything Jesus taught by any means. Whatever the historical Jesus believed about himself, the Jesus in our gospel accounts repeatedly preached his own bodily resurrection. But Peterson doesn't affirm the literal resurrection of Christ.
Okay, quick question, are you a Christian?
I suppose the most straightforward answer to that is yes, although I think it's let's leave it at yes.
Well, I'm a bit dissatisfied with that because there are so many kinds of Christians, and
Well,
I would never imagine that you were a very literal-minded Christian.
Well, there are truths other than the literal that perhaps are more truthful than even literal truths. There are many kinds of truth, and I don't mean that in a postmodern way, actually. But the truths that govern behavior and the truths that emerge from facts are not the same truths.
But do you believe that Jesus rose again from the dead? Literally.
I cannot answer that question. And the reason is because, okay, let me think about it for a minute, see if I can come up with a reasonable answer to that. Well, the first answer would be, it depends on what you mean by Jesus.
A historical human being that existed
in a body. And
in a body.
In a body. And,
yes.
And it was a physical body, and that it was on earth.
Yes. That it was on earth, and that was literally came back to life after death.
I would say that at the moment I'm agnostic about that issue.
You'd think that being a Christian would entail belief in the literal resurrection of Christ, but as you just heard, Peterson doesn't affirm the bodily resurrection of Jesus. He's agnostic. As the Apostle Paul said, "If Christ is not risen, our faith is in vain."
Did his body resurrect? I don't know.
Jordan does try to say that he, quote, believes in the, quote, resurrection, and I'll try to shed some light on what he's saying in a moment, but he's very careful in choosing his words. He is not saying that he believes that Jesus' physical body ceased all biological function, and the biological function was restarted after 72 hours.
And so I want to know more about it.
This is one thing I admire about what you do, is that you do not give glib answers. I remember watching you in an interview, and it was an older gentleman. He said, Joel, do you believe in the resurrection? And I was probably a 25-second response, because I could see well, what do you mean by dead? What do you mean by resurrection? Are you trying to claim me for your own? Because I'm sure, he's a Baptist, he's a Mormon, he's whatever.
Yeah, because one of the questions, one of the right responses to that is, what do you mean by that question, and why are you asking it?
Yeah.
Right, because it's not just a straightforward question by any stretch of the imagination. It's the same thing that happens when people say, well, do you believe in God? It's like, well, and with regards to the resurrection too, it's not even obvious what the Gospels mean by the resurrection. Like, it's not like it's a straightforward story. Christ comes back, but people don't really recognize him. Yeah. And he's sort of got his old body, but not quite, because he's not recognizable. And then he appears to a lot of people, but then the circumstances of what happens next are far from clear. And so there's this weird mingling in the Gospels themselves of the psychological and the symbolic and the literal. And it's not, people have argued about what that story means within the Christian camp for 2,000 years. So, and I've been talking...
Jordan doesn't hold views that most Christians would consider essential. For one, he doesn't believe in a literal God, which, again, I'm coming to. I'll try to explain what he does believe in, but it's a fact that he does not believe that a literal, supernatural, conscious being called God exists. He doesn't believe that this God consciously created the universe or consciously created humans in their current form, but he also doesn't believe in the literal resurrection of Jesus or the factual accuracy of the Bible. To quote Stephen Woodford, "For all intent and purposes, Peterson is an atheist who just so happens to personally find immense value in Christian myths/archetypes. He, like Richard Dawkins, doesn't believe in the literal existence of a God, the literal resurrection of a humanoid called Jesus Christ, or that our consciousness will continue to exist after our literal death. If you can call such a person a Christian, then yes, Peterson is one, but arguably, so is Bertrand Russell." End quote. A lot of his fans are Christians, but they aren't the kind of Christian Jordan Peterson is. So when they talk about God or the resurrection or their immortality, they often mean it literally. Peterson doesn't, and he never bothers to clarify. Unless you are incredibly precise and specific with your language to the point of tedium, Peterson will answer metaphorically and pretend that you meant the question metaphorically. However, there are a couple ways to formulate the question that make it harder for him to wriggle out of it.
For a moment. All right, thank you. I guess this question's mostly for Jordan Peterson. Just to hopefully enlighten a bit more what you mean by God, do you think that if all humanity were to cease to exist, does God still exist?
I don't think I know how to answer that. It's just, the situation is too hypothetical. I mean, I can take a crack at some of it, but there are lots of elements of being that would disappear if we disappeared. Now, and it isn't even obvious to what extent that's true, right? Because I don't really understand to what degree being itself is dependent on consciousness. Like the classic materialist Enlightenment view, which I would say is basically a 19th century view, something like that, is that if all consciousness was extinguished, the material substrate of the universe would continue unchanged. But I don't really buy that as an argument, because I think that the material substrate, I think that reality is I think that reality is an interaction between what we perceive of as the material substrate and consciousness itself. And so then when you destroy consciousness, you destroy reality. And what that leaves, I don't really understand, because it doesn't have any temporality in any obvious sense. It doesn't have any size in any obvious sense without the introduction of an invisible observer. So lots vanishes without human consciousness and self-consciousness. I don't know how to answer the question, does God vanish? Because that brings us back into the same problem that I was talking about earlier, is that it's not exactly easy to understand what people are talking about when they say God. You know, because when you ask the question, would God disappear? There's an assumption there that whatever God is understandable and boxable, like a simple concept, like a chair, and that we both share the same conception. And, you know, there's endless warnings in deep religious literature against assuming that you understand what that term means, or sometimes even for using the term. So that's the best I'm going to be able to do with that question.
For the kind of Christian I was, that was an extremely straightforward question. The answer would have been, yes, of course God would still exist whether or not we were here. In fact, that was the state of affairs before he created us. Hopefully it's clear by now that he's not exactly being straight with us, or at least that his conception of God is far from the norm. His denial of his atheism and insistence that he's a Christian fits into a much larger web of a worldview that's internally coherent for the most part, but extremely bizarre and ad hoc. And I think he constructed some of this web in order to defend belief in God in a rational scientific age. And a critical part of Peterson's theology, one that's necessary to understand his God, is his concept of truth.
Theory is true. Then you ask yourself, well, what do you mean by true?
The only way I use the word truth is in a realist sense. Something is true if it corresponds to reality. If you want to say that something is true in the sense that it's beneficial to believe it, then the word I use for that is beneficial. But that's essentially what Peterson means when he says that something is true. He means that it's beneficial to act as if it were true. Or as he sometimes puts it, it's true if it serves life.
The fundamental axiom that I'm playing with is something that was basically expressed by Nietzsche. And it's a definition of truth. And so I would say, if it doesn't serve life, it's not true.
So Nietzsche said truth serves life. Okay, in some sense, that's a Darwinian idea. Okay, if it's true enough so that if you act it out or hold it, that increases your chances of survival and reproduction over long spans of time, that's true.
Jordan Peterson's version of truth has been dubbed metaphorical truth, as distinguished from literal truth. Literal truth is just the way things actually are, independent of the effects on life or on conscious observers. A belief is true if it corresponds to reality. A belief is metaphorically true if it benefits you to believe it, or the benefits of acting as if it were true exceed the benefits of acting as if it weren't.
And so I have a category that I call literally false, metaphorically true. These are ideas that aren't true in the factual sense, but they are true enough that if you behave as if they were true, you come out ahead of where you would be if you behaved according to the fact that they're not true. So let me give you, people say everything happens for a reason, right? Well, unless you're talking about physics as the reason, everything doesn't happen for a reason. However, if you are the kind of person who believes that everything happens for a reason, and then some terrible tragedy befalls you, you may be on the lookout. Well, what's the reason that this happened? Maybe it's supposed to open some opportunity, and you won't miss that opportunity the way somebody who was preoccupied with their misfortune would. So
I happen to think these categories are quite useful since both literal and metaphorical truths are real and interesting in their own respects, but it's important to be able to distinguish them and recognize their relation to one another, which Peterson does not. Jordan isn't viewing metaphorical truth as a helpful little addition to our concept of truth as I am. He thinks this is it. This is what we all mean by true, really, or it's what we should mean if we think about it enough. He claims to believe that his version of pragmatic truth is more fundamental than literal truth.
Controversial. I mean, the claim I'm making is that scientific truth is nested inside moral truth, and moral truth is the final adjudicator.
It sounds like what you're saying is that truth is as much about action as it is about some sort of material, measurable, objective reality.
No, I'm saying it's more about action.
More about.
Oh yes, yes. The fundamentals of truth are those that guide action, and then the objective science is nested inside that. It has to be.
Right.
There's no way around that.
So, on Jordan's view, the fundamentals of truth are those that serve life, and the objective science is nested inside that. And just to be clear, Darwinian truth, as Jordan uses the term, is synonymous with metaphorical truth and pragmatic truth, and the flip side of that is what we've been calling literal truth, or scientific truth, realist truth, or Newtonian truth, as Peterson sometimes calls it. And I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page as far as vocab is concerned. As far as I can tell, Peterson and whoever he's engaging with uses those terms interchangeably within their respective categories. And to be clear, Darwin himself didn't have this conception of truth. I think Jordan is calling it Darwinian truth because it's similar to the concept of something being adaptive. This is obviously an important, useful idea, but the notion that realism is nested inside pragmatism just doesn't make any sense. And I would accuse anyone who contends that it does make sense of being motivated by something other than an honest inquiry into the nature of truth. One problem with Peterson's view of the primacy of metaphorical truth is that it leads to logical inconsistencies. If all that matters is the benefit of believing it, two logically incompatible beliefs can both be true in the same way at the same time. Think about a belief that's metaphorically true but literally false. For the sake of argument, assume that belief in heaven improves the lives of humans in some way, but belief in reincarnation produces a similar beneficial effect. The Christian heaven and reincarnation cannot both be true. So a Christian could say, because I was a good person, when I die, my consciousness will continue uninterrupted and I'll fly into the clouds to see my grandma again. And then a Hindu could immediately reply, because I was a good person, when I die, I'll be reincarnated into a higher caste. Without any help from literal truth, we would have to say that it's possible that both are true at the same time in the same way. And consider the opposite case of something that's literally true but metaphorically false. Sam Harris imagined an example of this where a husband discovered his wife was cheating on him and was so distraught by this knowledge that he committed suicide. How are we supposed to parse this out using only metaphorical truth?
You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths. Now, the claim about whether or not she's cheating on you is an intelligible claim. That's a claim that has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you wind up killing yourself based on your reaction to this unhappy truth. If you then wound up killing yourself, we could say at the end of the day, well, it would be better if he hadn't known that. It would certainly be better if she hadn't done that. It would have been better if he had married a different woman. Surely we would want to say that.
It might be better if he would have paid attention to his damn marriage and to attribute the cause of his demise to the existence of the photographs. This is why I brought up Josh Green, is that investigations into this kind of morality always frame it in such a way that...
Jordan, you have to grant one thing here. There's one piece that doesn't get moved here. You cannot move the piece that because you killed yourself, it's not true that she was having an affair. That move is not open to you.
If we take metaphorical truth to be superior, could the affair be true for the guy she's cheating with, but false for the husband she's cheating on? That would imply that something could be totally true for one person from their perspective and totally false for another person from their perspective, even though they're talking about the same thing in reality, which at least sounds like we're beginning to tread on postmodern terrain. Literal truth doesn't lead to problems like this because we're just defining truth as whatever reality happens to be, with no value judgment and no thought about how this truth influences us. Literal truth also has the special feature of being able to explain why metaphorical truth works. If something serves life, you can use literal truth to understand why. There are certain things we shouldn't be doing because they're dangerous, but the utility or pragmatism of behaving in certain ways has to be distinguished from whether or not something is true. That's the only way to even make the claim that there are things that are literally true but don't conduce to our survival or flourishing. Metaphorical truth is a fine idea, but to care about it to the exclusion of literal truth, or assert that metaphorical truth is more true, leads to absurdities and logical train wrecks. I would add that if you're actually worried about postmodernism corrupting science and philosophy, the guy who mocks Enlightenment views and wants to undermine fundamental epistemology should maybe be on your radar. The real question is why on earth anyone would bother to do this? Why would someone define truth in this particular way? The reality is that Peterson only performs these mental gymnastics when it comes to religion and God. In every other area, he talks like a normal person who understands the primacy of literal truth. But when it comes to God, religion, and morality, he suddenly changes all the rules. And I believe he's doing it in order to, among other things, accommodate religious belief.
You clearly have to have a conception of facts and truth that is possible to know, that exceeds what anyone currently knows and exceeds any concern about whether it is useful or compatible with your own survival even to know these truths.
Okay, well, then I would say that I don't think that facts are necessarily true. And I know that I'm gerrymandering the definition of truth, but I'm doing that on purpose because I'm trying to nest truth within a Darwinian framework, which I think is a moral framework.
You're choosing, following Nietzsche here, you're choosing to use the word true. You're choosing to freight it with some moral concerns that will make it very difficult for people to understand what you mean. A fact may be correct, but it's not true.
Right.
It seems to me this is counterproductive, and you lose nothing by granting that the truth value of a proposition can be evaluated whether or not this is a fact worth knowing or whether or not it's dangerous to know.
No, but that's the thing I don't agree with, because the highest truths, let's put it that way, the highest truths are moral truths. Nietzsche, he said that the West would degenerate both into nihilism and into totalitarianism, and that millions of people would die as a consequence of the death of God. And that's Dostoevsky prophesied exactly the same thing in The Devils, and it's exactly what happened. And I don't believe that we can get past the Scylla and Charybdis of nihilism and totalitarianism without going back to the past to find what it has to offer us, to bring it forward in an articulated manner. And of course, that's
Jordan Peterson doesn't believe very many of the things that the majority of Christians would consider essential to being a Christian. He says he believes in a God, but he isn't using the commonly accepted definitions of belief, God, or truth. We talked about truth in part 1, and God to a lesser extent, which if you haven't listened to already, I would recommend before this one. We'll get to what he means by belief in a minute. And I should say, if any of you find this to be a bit tedious, all this redefining of basic terms and trying to navigate one particular person's odd religious beliefs, I also find it a bit tedious. But I think it's important because, for one, I don't really see him going away. And his version of Christianity is gaining some popularity, so it's worth understanding in some detail. So before we finally get to the meat of what Jordan Peterson's God actually is, let me just set the stage with an exchange between Harris and Peterson.
The truth value of a proposition can be evaluated whether or not this is a fact worth knowing or whether or not it's dangerous to know.
No, but that's the thing I don't agree with, because the highest truths, let's put it that way, the highest truths are moral truths. And I know that I'm gerrymandering the definition of truth, but I'm doing that on purpose because I'm trying to nest truth within a Darwinian framework, which I think is a moral framework.
There's certain ways of paying attention that are dangerous, right? There are certain things that we shouldn't be doing which we're tempted to do.
Right. And I think one of those things is defining the world as in a materialist, realist terms. I happen to think that. And I have my reasons.
I think you are committed to elevating the concept of truth, or what you imagine to be elevating it, into this kind of the moral stratosphere where it entails
Yes,
goodness.
that is precisely and exactly what I'm doing. There's no doubt about it.
He goes to all the trouble of redefining these words and avoiding sounding like a materialist because he thinks we need Christianity and God. But with all our knowledge of science and philosophy, it's incredibly hard to believe any of that stuff. So he's trying to find an intellectually respectable way to believe in God and hold to Christian values in the present day. He believes that there's a lot of moral value and psychological truth in Christian mythology. And in fact, he believes that Western civilization was built upon a substructure of Judeo-Christian values. And if we don't maintain these values, our society will just fall apart, which is why he was featured so prominently in the Western Values episode. And now we're closer to what Peterson's God actually is. God fits in the category of metaphorical truth that we outlined in part 1. Jordan believes that it's extremely beneficial to believe in God. He thinks that it serves life, and that's what truth is by his definition. In his mind, what could be more true than something that's preventing the destruction of Western civilization? We need Christianity. So this leads to the question that I alluded to earlier. How are we supposed to deal with the death of God? At this point in history, how can it be defended on any rational grounds? Well, one way is to redefine truth. We can speak about truth in such a way as to protect God and Christianity from science and reason. That way, even if we're atheists like Jordan, we can preserve the important parts of the substructure that he believes religion created. So why is he, quote, gerrymandering the definition of truth and changing it in such a way that it entails goodness and not strictly what's real? The only reasonable conclusion that I can see is that he thinks we need to lie to keep everything going. Religion is a useful fiction. Actually, it's a necessary fiction, and we need to maintain this lie at the heart of civilization to prevent it from degenerating into, quote, nihilism and totalitarianism. In one interview citing Carl Jung, he said that your highest value is your God, because it serves the same function as a God psychologically. And on his view, it's difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish between a literal God and a highest value. Again, the purpose of all this is to preserve the function of religion, as he sees it, without running afoul of our scientific and philosophical progress. In other words, the purpose of all these games is to preserve the function of God without denying that God doesn't literally exist. The function that God served did exist. It changes people's behavior and the course of entire civilizations. So the idea of God had an influence in the real world, and unlike new atheists, he sees it as an overwhelmingly positive influence. So that function is what he believes in, and it's what he's trying to preserve in the wake of the death of God.
I would say that there's great purpose in looking at these ancient stories in the same way, Sam, as there's great purpose and utility in reading fiction. So, and I don't mean that in a derogatory manner. I mean, here's a sentence for you, and perhaps you can tell me what you make of it. There is great truth revealed in Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Shakespeare. How would you characterize that truth, though? Because it's certainly not factual by any stretch of the imagination. It's a different sort of truth.
The reality is that most religious people would be appalled by the claim that the Bible is a work of fiction, including the founders of the religion. Science doesn't come into conflict with Dostoevsky. It doesn't come into conflict with Shakespeare. It comes into conflict with religion, because the vast majority of religious people, past and present, believe it's literally true to some degree. If everyone understood the Bible's truth to be in the same category as Dostoevsky's fiction, that, in my view, would be a tremendous success. This is a question I've asked before, and one I don't really know the answer to. What is the future we should want for Christianity? I think the optimal state of affairs would be reducing it to a social club where people can meet and talk about things like meaning and wisdom, but I don't want it to have any political power at all, and I don't want a single person to believe it literally. But how could we potentially get there? As in, what do the intermediate steps look like? And if we couldn't reduce the power and influence of religion to the optimal levels, shouldn't we still aim for reducing it? I don't often invoke Ken Ham to support my arguments, but he, along with most other biblical literalists, believe that if you doubt the literal truth of any part of the Bible, you've taken the first step on a path that almost certainly leads to atheism. What I'm getting at here is, what if Jordan Peterson looks like the future of Christianity? Is that really a bad thing? I definitely don't think it's optimal, but I don't think you can argue that it's worse than what we have now, and it might prove to be an intermediate step to where we wanted to go anyway. If the majority of Christians became Jordan Peterson Christians, who explicitly think of the Bible as fiction, I would find that preferable to what we have now. In fact, that's pretty close to what I described a second ago. Christianity as a social club where some people meet to talk about things like meaning and wisdom, while explicitly recognizing that it's mythology. That actually is pretty close to what Jordan is promoting. I mentioned in part 1 that Jordan isn't taking the time to clarify to his audience that he doesn't believe what they think he believes. It seems to me that a lot of them just want to be told that their religion isn't stupid. They can accept science and reason without becoming an atheist. A cynical person might say that Peterson doesn't want to lose money by alienating a huge segment of his audience, and he's just pandering to the religious crowd. A more charitable view might be that he's just unaware that a large segment of his audience is not on the same page as him. I don't know what the answer is, but I suspect that his Nietzschean view of the death of God as potentially devastating to Western civilization has something to do with it. If he really believes that the continuation of Western civilization is at stake, and that we have no reason to be moral without believing in some version of God, then he might not want to tamper with the Christian beliefs of some of his audience if he doesn't have to. On Peterson's view, you could almost think of God as reduced to an abstract principle that justifies objective morality and creates a foundation on which order can form.
You can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know. I mean, look, in Crime and Punishment, for example.
So you think when you don't do those things, basically...
So Harris does not believe in any gods and is therefore an atheist. But think about what Peterson is saying there. Your behavior is the criterion determining what you are, rather than what you consciously believe. I think this working definition of belief has obvious implications for Peterson when he calls himself a Christian. He doesn't rob banks or murder, and by his definition, that's living as if Christianity is true. This no true Scotsman reasoning functions as a defense against data that doesn't fit in Jordan's worldview. So when I show you an atheist who's not a murderer, or large groups of atheists in certain countries that are better to live in than highly religious countries, which, by the way, is the rule and not the exception, he can just say, well, they're not really atheists. And if I show you Christian murderers, well, they're not really Christians. In a Reddit AMA, Peterson declared that, quote, Nazism was an atheist doctrine. So you heard him claim that refraining from murder and rape constitutes being a Christian, but it's not as if before Jesus came along everyone thought those things were just fine. You don't get to claim that opposition to murder, rape, and bank robbery are exclusively Christian, because those sorts of things are condemned cross-culturally and were forbidden by law prior to the advent of Christianity. These values are not unique to Christianity, and not all Christians have them. The fact that prohibitions on these sorts of activities arise independently in all cultures strongly suggests that human nature is in play to some degree. As Hitchens was fond of saying, the Jews wouldn't have gotten as far as Mount Sinai if they were under the impression that murder and theft were okay. It does make sense in light of game theory and evolutionary biology that these sorts of norms would emerge naturally. Peterson tends to dislike, I think rightly, those who claim that practically everything about us is a result of cultural conditioning and resist attributing anything to human nature. But he regularly claims that the only reason we don't rape and murder is because of the Christian culture we grew up in.
Dostoevsky said straightforwardly, if there's no God, so if there's no higher value, let's say, if there's no transcendent value, then you can do whatever you want. And that's the question that he's investigating. And you see, this is why I have such frustration, say, with people like Sam Harris, the sort of radical atheists, because they seem to think that once human beings abandon their grounding in the transcendent, that the plausible way forward is with a kind of purist rationality that automatically attributes to other people equivalent value. It's like, I just don't understand that. They believe that that's the rational pathway. What the hell is irrational about me getting exactly what I want from every one of you whenever I want it at every possible second? Why is that irrational? And how possibly is that more irrational than us cooperating so we can both have a good time of it? I don't understand that. I mean, it's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure naked self-interest. How is that irrational? I don't understand that. Where's the pathway from rationality to an egalitarian virtue? Why the hell not every man for himself and the devil take the hindmost? It's a perfectly coherent philosophy. And it's actually one that you can institute in the world with a fair bit of material success if you want to do it. So I don't see, to me, I think that the universe that people like Dawkins and Harris inhabit is so intensely conditioned by mythological presuppositions that they take for granted the ethic that emerges out of that as if it's just a given, a rational given. And this, of course, precisely not Nietzsche's observation as well as Dostoevsky's. That's Nietzsche's observation. You don't get it. The ethic that you think is normative is a consequence of its nesting inside this tremendously lengthy history, much of which was expressed in mythological formulation. You wipe that out. You don't get to keep all the presuppositions and just assume that they're rationally axiomatic.
If you're truly acting selfishly and want to maximize the benefits you receive from other people, you need to cooperate with them. You can use game theory to demonstrate mathematically why cooperation ends up producing better outcomes for the individual in the long run. So if you're asking what's irrational about screwing everyone over all the time and cheating them, the answer is that it depends. It depends on how long the game is. If you're only concerned about the next 10 seconds of your life, then yes, screw everyone over, abandon altruism, and behave like a psychopath. But if you're thinking farther than 10 seconds in the future, you're not going to want to do that. It's in your interest to not have everyone hate you, which they will if you gain a reputation as one totally unconcerned for anyone other than yourself. If you're acting purely selfishly and rationally, you should cooperate with others and behave altruistically and show kindness. People will reciprocate, you'll acquire a valuable reputation that will benefit you in the future, and you won't be punished in various ways by other people. People can choose who they interact with, so always screwing them over is not in your long-term self-interest. I'm sure you've noticed, but it feels good to help other people and do kind things. Your brain rewards you for those actions with pleasure. And why would that sort of behavior be incentivized unless it was in some way adaptive? Richard Dawkins, in his book The Selfish Gene, explains how selfish genes can give rise to altruistic individuals. If genes are the unit of selection, if natural selection acts on the gene level, then it's in the interest of the gene you're carrying for you, the individual, to behave altruistically to other individuals who are also carrying a copy of that gene. The gene is acting entirely selfishly. It just wants as many copies of itself as possible. But the optimal strategy from the gene's perspective is for the individual, the carrier of the gene, to help other carriers of the same gene and refrain from harming them, all things being equal. I'm not saying this is right because it's natural. I'm only trying to explain why evolution would have crafted human nature in such a way to give rise to pro-sociality and altruism, prohibitions against murder and theft, norms that promote cooperation, and so on. And there's a lot in the selfish gene, by the way, and this is only one part of it. Dawkins also invents the word meme in that book. So moving up the scale of emergence from the gene level to the level of organisms, where we live, up here, nature has created non-zero-sum games. A zero-sum game is an interaction between two people in which one wins totally and the other loses totally. A non-zero-sum game is one in which the benefits accrued by cooperation exceed benefits accrued by screwing over others, at least in the long run. Peterson would have a point if everything was a zero-sum game, but that's not the situation we're in. In any environment where non-zero-sum games arise, evolution will select for cooperation. In such environments, cooperation and altruism is adaptive for the same reason anything else would be adaptive. It's favored by natural selection. And this is why I brought up the iterated prisoner's dilemma. When you have multiple, non-zero-sum interactions with the same people over and over again, those who take into account the interests of others will be favored by natural selection. As long as selection is on the gene level, and the conflicts we find ourselves in as social animals are not zero-sum, these things will be selected for. You can demonstrate mathematically, using game theory, that in environments that create non-zero-sum games, cooperation maximizes individual self-interest as well as collective flourishing. As social animals, we all sort of understand this intuitively, even without any game theory or evolutionary biology to explain why we feel this way. And of course, Peterson also understands everything I just said. When he's not speaking in the context of religion, he's completely on the same page and knows that you'd essentially have to be a math denier to believe that psychopathic selfishness is the most rational long-term strategy. And yet, he said in that clip, quote, "It's as if the psychopathic tendency is irrational. There's nothing irrational about it. It's pure, naked self-interest. How is that irrational?" End quote. Again, if you're really acting in your own self-interest, you want other people to be on your side and not against you. He said that you can employ that kind of selfishness with great material success. But again, it depends how long the game you're playing is. It demonstrably does not work in the long term. If the kind of immoral behavior he's outlining were actually in our rational long-term interests, natural selection would have favored a morality that took the more efficient route. And it did take the more efficient route, and that's what I've been trying to explain. And not only with humans, but with other social species as well. In one interview when he wasn't speaking in the context of religion, Jordan casually said that you shouldn't act totally selfishly, quote, because everyone will hate you, which is essentially a 40,000-foot view of what I'm trying to say. The last questioner in the Matt Dillahunty-Jordan Peterson debate asked something along the lines I've been arguing. Roughly, isn't there evolutionary logic behind having an innate sense of morality? And don't we have morality in common with other cultures and with other species? In response, Jordan talked about Carl Jung and then said this.
I tried to lay out these views, the answer to your question, in detail in my first book. It's about 600 pages long. And it's really, 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 really hard. But it does address what you're asking. And I don't think there's a real simpler way of doing it. I didn't find one.
I've noticed that this is a bit of a habit for Peterson. When he can't defend what he's saying, he'll respond with something like, well, it would take me 40 hours to explain what I mean by that. Or, you'd have to read these several books or watch that entire lecture series to even begin to understand what I'm getting at. For a long time, I've felt like Jordan Peterson has had some kind of spell over all of us. It seems like nearly everyone is either foaming at the mouth and can't think clearly about him because they hate him so much, or he gets a total pass and is immediately forgiven when he says objectively stupid things, like the Soviet Union was a secular humanist country, or that Nazism was an atheist doctrine, or my personal favorite, that ancient humans, possibly through the use of psychedelics, knew about the double helix structure of DNA thousands of years ago. And why does he suspect this to be true? Because of ancient paintings of two snakes wrapped around each other, which happens to be how snakes mate. He made this claim on 2 occasions, at least on film. The link is in the description. He really said that ancient humans knew about the double helix structure of DNA because he sees paintings of snakes wrapped around each other. Again, the link is in the description and you should see it for yourself. Jordan's fans often claim that his opponents misrepresent him, and I can tell you from doing research for these episodes, that's absolutely true. And I find this frustrating because no one needs to attack him for beliefs he doesn't have to cast doubt on his reliability as a philosopher or scientist. Why is anyone misrepresenting his views when his views include sympathy to alternative medicine, flirtations with climate change denial, and a claim that ancient shamans knew about the molecular structure of DNA? Again, it's like everyone is either foaming at the mouth and can't think straight, or they'll give him a pass for anything. He also seems to get a pass for his Christian apologetic tropes, like we would have no reason to refrain from rape and murder without God. At least one difference between Jordan and a YouTube creationist who would say the same thing is that Peterson redefines every other word he uses in order to make his point, which is why his speech on religion can be so irritating and unclear.
Of being deliberately obtuse and obfuscating. In any case, ask yourself, if Ray Comfort or William Lane Craig asserted that all atheists are murderers, how would you react? Would you allow them to redefine every relevant word to make such a sentence coherent? I don't think so. And so just in case you're inclined to allow Jordan such a luxury, please consider not.
It's strange to me that I'm not sitting here with somebody like Ray Comfort when I'm told you're not really an atheist because you're too good to be an atheist. And this is what atheists hear all the time when they come out. They've been sidelined because of religious privilege around the world for years. And then atheists come out to their family members or friends or people they've known for years. And they're like, you're an atheist? How can that be? You're such a good person. I've known you all this time. It's because the mindset of what people have about what an atheist is has been poisoned by religious proclamations. We have been denigrated from the pulpit, and it has seeped into every aspect of culture, right up to the height of intellectual pursuits. And it's time for that to end.
That's all I have for you today. Okay, I have 2 new patrons to thank, Richard Crossan and Daniel Trilling. Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Daniel. And I have to thank my Hall of Fame patrons, Peach Machine, Jesta, and Phil Stillwell. And you can support this show on a per-episode basis at patreon.com/counter, where you can earn early access to every episode and access to bonus episodes. If you don't have the money to support on Patreon, but you still, roughly speaking, presuppose the metaphorical substrate of the archetypal dominance hierarchy, you can like us on Facebook, leave a 5-star lobster, or tell your friends about neo-Marxism. Our theme music was written and performed by the band Whalers. The song is called Magic Tricks and was used with permission. Thank you for joining me today. I've been Emerson Green, and I'll see you next time.